It's all the things we talk about just getting, I sound negative, and it's just all the major forces seem to be getting more alarming, more concerning. And this has nothing to do with just an election. I'm not talking about left versus right. I'm talking about the major forces. Obviously, debt, geopolitics, inflation, currencies. It's madness right now in a lot of ways. I mean, we've got anarchy in Syria now. You've got Turkey supporting the U.S. Turkey's a NATO country. It's really the first time a real open kind of proxy war between NATO and the West, with Turkey supporting this. And, whenever there's anarchy in Syria, that's always a possible humanitarian crisis. You've got hundreds of billions still going to the Ukraine, V-rockets going into Russia. It's a bloodbath. I thought it was an avoidable war. I think the sanctions have backfired. I think it was the worst foreign policy decision America's made in a long time. You've got Biden trying to escalate this war before Trump comes in to try and solve it. Whether he can or can't is debatable. You've got here in Europe, where I am, you've got coalitions breaking down in Germany, in France, in the UK. We've just lost a prime minister. We've got lots of inflation and economic problems that really don't make the headlines always in the West and are not fully understood, but I see it on the streets here. You've got a recession in the US, in my opinion, already here versus a ripping Pavlovian, Fed centralized markets. And you've got Trump, love him or hate him, he's a major disruption in the backdrop of a highly levered world. So a lot of change is coming. So there's new changes, but there's old problems that aren't necessarily solvable in one term. I'll just stop at this point. I've said for years the same thesis that I look at historically and financially. When you have a debt crisis, 36 trillion in public debt in the US, but everywhere in the world, we're 330 trillion globally, outpacing GDP 3-1. When you have a debt crisis, that always leads to eventually some type of financial crisis, always a currency crisis, which usually means an inflation crisis, which is very painful for the man on the street. When you have inflation, you usually get social unrest. And social unrest is almost, without exception, followed by some type of extreme centralization and or even worse, war. And whether you have a peace deal with Lebanon and Israel and then an escalation in Syria or what we're going to do in the East, I worry, and I really hope I'm wrong. I hope war doesn't become the final distraction from the elephant in the room, which is really poorly managed governments, poorly managed foreign and domestic and monetary policies for years of postponing and delaying and extending and pretending at the expense of the currency and the inflation and the man on the street from just really bad policies, and trying to postpone the debt ramifications that are already happening in a lot of ways and trying to be paid off in other ways. But I see a really volatile, polarized, and dangerous world. And I hope it doesn't lead to more military escalation, because again, in a nuclear war, that's crazy. But we are seeing extreme signs of currency wars, as Rickard would say, his book that came out years ago. He's been very, I'll have to say, prescient in that and foreshadowing a lot of the things that we're seeing playing out now. So the themes we've talked about for years are going to continue to play out. It's just a question of to what degree of madness and appalling consequences or happy endings or mid-happy endings we have. That's to be determined. But I'm not the most optimistic person right now, sadly. With 30,000 feet, I think, I'm very proud of the Constitution and the three branches of government that our founding fathers came up with and the ideals of our founding fathers. I think the Fed has become a dangerous and unconstitutional fourth branch of government, central banks in general. I also think the base layer incentives of major corporations, big government, big corporations, and the hidden government, the base layer incentives of the military, of the intel agencies, and the foreign policies that they direct that no one reads about in a Google search. And that's somewhat dark. They have a massive influence on policy that is really indifferent to who's in the White House. I think under the Biden administration, you can't deny that there was a perception of weakness under Biden's mental state and who was really leading the country, not just in the last 10 minutes or the last few months, but in the last few years. I know I've said this before, when he came to the Democratic caucus 3 years ago, even then when I was in Northern Virginia talking to people in DC, they said I didn't understand a word he was saying. This was 3 years ago. And that shouldn't be insulting. That shouldn't even be partisan. That should be a concern for everyone when our president is clearly lacking in some of the mental horsepower. And I think you could argue that the world did take advantage of that. We had a fiasco in Afghanistan. We had either a planned or indirect fiasco on our borders. I think we had a fiasco in weaponizing the US dollar against Russia, a major nuclear power in bed already with the BRICS. Even his former boss, Barack Obama, in 2015 said, don't weaponize a neutral world reserve currency. So who was making decisions? You could argue it was Biden. My guess is it really wasn't. And that's what scares me the most about the last 4 years. Who really was in charge? The Pentagon, at the cabinet, in the Oval Office. To your point, Trump, as RFK Jr. said, he's an impolitical figure. He is definitely a force of personality. There's no doubt that unlike 2016, he's coming with a much stronger agenda. You could say he has a learning curve. He's a little more cynical than he was about who he's going to pick to advise. I think he's picked a pretty good team around him. In a lot of ways, Trump reminds me of a George Custer. Sometimes a fine line between the sublime and ridiculous. I mean, all the impeachment processes, all the lawfare against him, all the media against him, he just keeps coming back. I think it does matter this time who's in the White House. And again, for some, it's wringing their hands. For others, it's a sigh of relief. We're definitely going to see some change. That's for sure. I wasn't surprised by the result, but I said regardless of who was going to win when it was still up in the air, I didn't envy either the type of debt background that they're coming into with 36 trillion in public debt, 100 trillion in combined household, government, and corporate debt. I mean, it's different in a lot of ways. I said it was kind of like being nominated the captain of the Titanic after the iceberg's been hit. You're going to get blamed for not having enough lifeboats no matter what. There's going to be casualties here. You know, when Trump came into the White House in 2016, entitlements, interest on government debt and military expenses was 65% of tax receipts. Well, now it's twice that much, so there's not a lot of wiggle room here. And in those same costs, entitlements, interest in military was 75% of the budget. And so there's not a lot of wiggle room either. When you talk about the Department of Government Efficiency, I have no doubt that Trump and Vivek have massive capacity to create pink slips in the swamp, so to speak, of DC. Absolutely. They're talking about 75% layoffs across agencies, getting rid of the Department of Education. Again, love it or hate it, there's great optics to this notion of America's like a Soviet bureaucracy in DC. You feel it. This on Route 66 or 495 going to Maryland or coming out of Northern Virginia, just this caravan of government agent kind of bureaucrats, many would say, who do nothing. They would obviously argue differently, but the goal by our 250th birthday in 2 years with Doge is to shave $2 trillion off of the expenses. So, okay, that has fantastic optics. You have to fire a lot of people in DC to come up with that number. Yet, for every 25 basis point cut, you can cut 25 billion off of government interest expense. So you can do that also to get the Fed to cooperate. I think they will for other reasons. They're going to be cutting rates because they have to debase the currency. But, these policies, he's coming in with an agenda. Like I've said, there's great optics and frankly some relief to see the fat cut in the swamp, as Trump has said, and Doge will do, I think, an aggressive blitzkrieg job in cutting fat. Whether you think it's good fat or bad fat, it's to be determined. But that will likely happen. I don't think he's not going to keep his promise there. I don't think Musk or Vivek want to go down and not keep their promise. There are consequences to it. Whether it's this Doge program, whether it's the tariffs, whether it's reshoring jobs, or even mass deportations of immigrants, whether you like them or not, those policies are inherently and highly inflationary, in my opinion. So in a lot of ways, Trump can get a lot of things he wants done. I think the one mistake he made, in addition to these promises, was promising that he would beat inflation. If I had been an advisor to Trump, I would have said, you have a lot of ideas, don't say that out loud. Like George Bush when he said, read my lips, no more taxes. Or when his son got on an aircraft carrier and said, peace in Iraq. It was too soon. Now he wants a weaker dollar. Uncle Sam needs a weaker dollar. The rest of the world, which is $13 trillion in dollar-denominated debt, needs a weaker dollar. And yet since he came in office, and despite the Fed cutting rates feverishly, the DXY has jumped from 103 to above 107. It reminds me a lot of Bush in 2001 when Greenspan was cutting rates feverishly. And yet, the DXY went from 108 to 121. In some ways, the bond market, more than the Fed, is determining the strength of the dollar right now. And he needs to debase the dollar. He needs to cut the dollar down. He needs to cut debt to GDP down. I don't see how he does that without an inflationary policy, whether it's at the Fed or whether it's with his own spending. I don't know. Even with cutting at the DC level that fat, there's still going to be trillion-dollar deficits. And that delta has to be filled with mouse click money at the Fed. And frankly, and this is my personal belief, I'm all in favor of cutting some of the waste out of the swamp. But if Trump is really sincere and he's truly a maverick and he really wants to solve the problem in DC, he's going to have to start not with just the Department of Education or Agriculture and firing bureaucrats. He has to go after K Street. He has to go after the lobbying, the wolves of K Street, because that's the biggest threat to democracy. It's the biggest threat to the ideals of our founding fathers, this legalized bribery, whether that's APAC or whether that's rifles or whether that's big tech, big pharma, big government, big media. The Fed itself, to me, is a monopoly power. When I was in law school, the antitrust ideals of the Clayton Act and the Sherman Act, these were important. We've got massive monopoly powers who are paying for influence, including, again, this is not about against crypto, but crypto was his major donor. And now we're talking about a Bitcoin strategic reserve or stockpiling. That should be a problem for all of us worrying about monopoly powers. And I think, the fact that 3 or 5 companies own our media completely, that's a major threat to democracy. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street have immense influence on our economics and also on our congressional voting patterns. I think big pharma is an anathema to good health. So all of these things, I'd rather see that swamp splintered into 1,000 pieces than just a bunch of 60,000 a year employees at some department in DC. So I think there's a lot more than just the optics of Vivek and Elon that need to be addressed and looked at hard. Of course, our media won't look at it. Our mainstream media won't look at these things at all because they're completely useless. But alternative media that isn't just emotional or quacky and looking for clickbait, alternative media that has smart conversations, whether they're on your platforms or others, that is a saving grace for the monopolization of information. Because, Rothschild said, if you give me the control of the money supply, I don't care who's in office. Now think about it. If you control the money and you control the information, that's power. And I hate to be dramatic, but Mussolini's definition of fascism is the perfect marriage of government and corporations. And whether that was under a red or blue administration, we've had that for far too long in America. Too much big corporate influence over our politics. I would love to see that addressed squarely. I'd love to see Vivek and Elon with the Matt Taibbi on their team talking more about these problems. And we'll see. There's a lot of optics, but long answer to a short question, I think a lot of the things he's going to try, I have nothing against trying to reshore jobs to America. And from the Midwest, Canada, I've seen the Rust Belt get destroyed when we made the American dream made in China since 2001 and the WTO, when we said all our toasters will be bought by Chinese. Well, we forgot to say they'd be making our toasters, then sending them back to us. So millions of people lost their jobs in my backyard in Ohio and Michigan and Minnesota and the Midwest, Pennsylvania. I do think Trump is sincere about reshoring manufacturing. The irony is with tariffs, that's typically a protective measure to protect your manufacturing. But most of our manufacturing was sent out east and sent to South America and El Salvador and cut and sew products, or sent to Asia for tech or for manufacturing car parts. We've got to bring those companies and those industries back into the U.S. We can't just blame government on that. That was the C-suites of companies that get where the CEOs are paid by share price. They want higher margins. The best way to do that is cheaper labor. They sold the American dream out, and politics allowed it. So if his tariffs is a way to incentivize companies that have American flags that are manufacturing in China back into America, I'm all for it. The problem is that's painful in the short term. It's wonderful in the long term. I hope he realizes, and I hope the American people realize, there can't be a miracle in 2 years, and it can't be done cheap, and it's going to be cost to that. And we'll see how Trump can handle the austerity or the reality behind that, if he can be man enough to say it, like a fireside chat during the FDR era. I think if the people believe his motives are sincere, they may be willing to make some sacrifices. I think the best policy is an honest policy. I want all these things for America. They don't come free. They don't come cheap. We're going to have to expend. We're probably going to have to debase our currency to do these things. And, we'll see. But there's a lot of forces at play here.